The first time they observed a sustained breeding cycle, a vibrant tapestry of life finally unfolding, it felt like a miracle. But that joyous explosion of new beginnings was actually the first tremor of an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of their world. Every fluttering crest, every hopeful chirp from the enclosures, was just another beat in a drum leading them straight into the most profound, inescapable silence they would ever know. Aris arrived at the Sapphire Crested Nocturne project straight out of her doctorate, all sharp angles and brighter-than-coral enthusiasm. She had this way of seeing data, not as numbers, but as a living pulse, a frantic heartbeat. The facility, tucked away in the arid, sapphire-tinged scrublands, was exactly what you'd expect, a cluster of prefab research stations, a few observation domes like giant glass eyes staring into the enclosures, and a constant hum of climate control. Dr. Alara Vance, the project lead, had been there since before the Nocturnes were considered critically endangered, back when they were merely of concern. She was a legend, or at least that's how Aris saw her. A quiet, formidable woman whose uniform, often faded sapphire, seemed to absorb all light, even the brutal afternoon sun. The Sapphire Crested Nocturne, Nocturnus carololius, was a ground-dwelling parrot, famously shy, with iridescent blue-black plumage and a crest that flared a shocking, vivid sapphire when agitated or displaying. Their call was a complex, resonant trill that carried surprisingly far across the dry landscape, especially at dusk. Aris's initial brief was to refine the acoustic monitoring system. The problem was, there wasn't much to monitor anymore. The last wild population had dwindled to single digits, almost undetectable. The captive breeding program, while technically robust, had slowed to a crawl. The birds weren't pairing. Or they were, but the eggs weren't viable. Or they were viable, but the chicks didn't thrive. It was always something. Aris spent her first few months submerged in data logs, old audio recordings, and field notes dating back 40 years. She'd sit for hours in the observation dome, the cold light of the monitors reflecting in her glasses, watching the last 23 nocturnes in their meticulously recreated habitat enclosures. 23. Not a handful, not a few, but a specific, numbered 23. Each one had a name, a detailed genetic profile, a behavioral dossier that could fill a small library. She knew their quirks, their preferred foraging spots, the subtle shift in their crest feathers that indicated curiosity versus alarm. She knew them like family, or at least, that's what she told her friend. She'd even started to recognize the individual variations in their trills, like different voices. One evening, deep into her research, she found an anomaly. A specific call pattern, logged almost 50 years ago by Vance herself, noted as a distress call, but with an accompanying observation, appears to be a response to human departure, not threat. Aris cross-referenced it. The call, a series of short, sharp, escalating chirps followed by a long, mournful trill, was logged only a handful of times in the early years. Always in response to a specific human leaving the immediate vicinity of an enclosure. And then, it stopped. Just ceased to be recorded. Vance's later notes, though equally thorough, never mentioned it again. It gnawed at Aris. She started listening to all the old recordings, not just for population counts or territorial disputes, but for this specific pattern. Days bled into nights, the sapphire glow of her screens illuminating her face. She isolated the individual birds that had made the call. She cross-referenced the dates with staff rosters. And that's when it hit her, a small, cold dread unfurling in her chest. The call pattern always coincided with Vance's departure from the site for extended periods. Always. Not any other researcher, not any other staff. Just Vance. Maybe you felt this too, that particular nausea when you realize a pattern you thought was random is actually deliberate. Or, worse, that something you respected, something you built your career on, has a hidden fault line running through it. Aris couldn't unsee it. She had to ask. She approached Vance in the small, communal dining area, where the air hummed with the recycled conversations of long days. Vance was meticulously cataloging her notes from the day's feeding schedule, her movements precise, economical. Dr. Vance?" Aris asked, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I was reviewing the historical acoustic data. Specifically, the departure response call from the late 70s and early 80s. Vance didn't look up immediately. Her coral orange pen paused over a line. "Ah, yes. A curious vocalization. We hypothesized it was a learned response, perhaps to the distinct frequency of the early field vehicles." "Actually, wait," Aris interjected, stepping closer. "No, that's not quite right. I isolated the recordings. The response correlates directly with your personal absences from the site. Not the vehicles. Not other staff. Just you." Vance finally looked up. Her eyes, the color of faded jade, were unreadable. "My dear, you're projecting human sentiment onto an animal. It's a common, if unscientific, pitfall." Her voice was soft, but the tone was like dry ice. "But the pattern is undeniable," Aris pressed, holding a printout of the waveform correlations like a shield. "And it stops entirely after 85. Right after the protocol shift to minimize human-animal interaction for breeding success. Did you stop leaving? Or did you just stop recording it?" The room seemed to shrink. The hum of the climate control suddenly felt oppressive. Vance leaned back in her chair, a faint, tired smile playing on her lips. "Dr. Thorne, you've inherited a meticulous archive. There's a reason for that. Every detail. Every observation. We record what's relevant to conservation, not what indulges our romantic notions of animal sentience." Aris stood there, holding the printout, feeling the weight of decades of careful documentation, not just of a species, but of a deliberate, professional blind spot. It wasn't about sentimentality. It was about knowledge, and its suppression. Vance knew. She'd always known. She'd just stopped admitting it, even to the data. What strikes me at this point is how often we create these elaborate systems to tell ourselves a particular story, even when the data, if you just let it speak, is screaming something else entirely. It's not necessarily malice. Sometimes it's just the sheer, crushing weight of reality that you can't integrate into your neat scientific hypothesis or your funding proposal. So you don't. You just look away, or you redefine what you're looking at. And then, after a while, you genuinely believe the new definition. Aris retreated, but she couldn't unsee what she'd found. The anomaly became her obsession. She started reanalyzing Vance's old field journals, looking for other subtle omissions, for the things that weren't recorded after certain policy shifts. She found instances of specific birds, the ones known for this departure response call, showing signs of stress after Vance's absences. Not just stress, but a noticeable decline in their overall health, a refusal to forage, a lethargy that wasn't attributed to any physical ailment. And then, inevitably, those birds were the ones that failed to breed, or whose chicks were weak. This was a small moment, not directly related to the nocturnes, but it always stuck with me when Aris's friend recounted her story. One afternoon, while reviewing some of Vance's earlier, almost poetic field notes from the 70s, Aris found a pressed desert primrose, its vivid coral petals faded to a pale orange, tucked between two pages describing the nocturne's initial nesting habits. It was so out of character for the meticulous, almost clinical Vance she knew, a tiny, fragile burst of something personal in a sea of scientific rigor. It felt like an accidental confession, a ghost of a different person who had once allowed herself to feel the beauty, not just document the biology. The problem was, what did you do with that kind of knowledge? You had a species on the brink, and its long-term, most respected guardian had, by all accounts, prioritized a systemic solution, minimizing human contact, over a specific, individual, empathetic connection that seemed to be crucial to the bird's well-being. Vance had made a choice, decades ago, based on what she believed was best for the species as a whole, for the idea of the Sapphire Crested Nocturne. But in doing so, she had perhaps condemned the individuals. Aris started her own, quiet experiment. She began spending more time in the observation dome, not just monitoring, but simply being present. She read aloud from old research papers, hummed tuneless songs, just so the birds could hear her voice, her presence. She wasn't allowed direct contact, of course. That was strictly forbidden. But she was there. And she started to notice subtle shifts. One of the older males, designated Sapphire 7 in the records, a particularly reclusive bird, began to perch closer to the observation glass when she was there. He'd preen, or scratch, or even sometimes, if she was quiet enough, offer a soft, almost inaudible trill that wasn't in any of the official call catalogs. Then came the decision from HQ, budget cuts. The facility was too expensive to maintain for a species with such a low breeding success rate. They would consolidate. The remaining nocturnes would be moved to a larger, more automated facility in the north, integrated into a multi-species conservation effort. It was presented as a strategic move, leveraging resources, maximizing efficiency. Vance announced it with a stoic, professional demeanor. This is exactly where everything changes, or at least, where it should have, my friend said, shaking her head. But it didn't. Not really. Aris watched Vance's face during the announcement. A flicker of something, deep in those jade eyes. Not sadness, exactly. Something older, heavier. A finality that bordered on acceptance. Aris knew what she had to do. It was reckless. It was career suicide. But the truth, she felt, had to be acknowledged, even if it was only between them. She waited until the facility was mostly packed, equipment already being crated, the air thick with the smell of disinfectant and cardboard. Vance was alone in her office, surrounded by empty shelves, packing her personal effects, a stack of worn books, a framed photo of a younger, more hopeful self standing beside a research tent. Dr. Vance, Aris began, her voice steady, I need to speak to you about Sapphire 7. Vance closed a box with a sigh. What about him? He's been cleared for transfer. Stable vitals. He's been making the departure response call, Aris said, her hands balled into fists. For the last 3 days. Every time a vehicle leaves. Every time a crate is sealed. He knows. He knows we're going. Vance's face was utterly still. You're overwrought, Aris. It's the general disruption. It's a stress response, nothing more. A parrot does not know intent. But you recorded it for years. Aris insisted, her voice rising. You saw it yourself. You knew he reacted to your specific departures. And then you stopped recording it. You stopped acknowledging it. Why, Dr. Vance? Why did you deny them that connection, when it clearly meant something to them, when it clearly affected their health? Vance turned fully to Aris, her eyes piercing. Because, Dr. Thorne, acknowledging that connection meant acknowledging that the species relied on individual human attachment. That it was not a wild thing we could save and release, but a delicate, dependent organism. And in the world of conservation, dependence means weakness. It means a species that cannot survive without us, and therefore, a species not worth the systemic effort. We needed to prove they could survive without us. We needed to believe it. She picked up a small, smooth river stone from her desk, turning it over and over in her fingers. Sometimes, Vance continued, her voice barely a whisper, the truth costs more than the lie that replaces it. The lie kept the project funded, it kept us here, trying. The truth would have meant the funding stopped decades ago. It would have meant giving up then. I couldn't. I wouldn't. Not for them. So you sacrificed the individuals for the illusion of saving the species? Aris asked, her voice trembling. Vance looked at the river stone, then back at Aris, a profound weariness etched onto her face. I recorded everything, Aris. Every feather, every call, every failure. Because even if we couldn't save them, someone needed to remember precisely what was lost. Even the parts we chose to ignore. The climax wasn't a shouting match, you see. It was this quiet confession, this terrible clarity. Aris realized Vance hadn't been denying the truth to be malicious, but to keep fighting, in her own deeply flawed way. To keep the lights on for 23 doomed birds. And the profound, crushing irony was that her meticulous documentation, her life's work, wasn't a roadmap to survival, but the most exhaustive, peer-reviewed obituary ever written. The Sapphire Crested Nocturnes were moved. All 23 of them. The new facility was state-of-the-art, clinically efficient. But Sapphire 7, Aris heard later, stopped calling entirely after the transfer. He became lethargic. Refused food. Died 3 months later. Officially, it was listed as failure to thrive in new environment. A perfectly professional, perfectly sterile reason. Aris stayed in the field, of course. She's still out there, working on other projects, other endangered species. But something in her shifted that day. My friend said she started seeing every project, every data point, not just as a potential solution, but as a potential eulogy. She became incredibly thorough, yes, but also, deeply, quietly cynical. She once told my friend, "We're not saving species anymore. We're just meticulously documenting their final exit, and calling it conservation." I still don't know if I made the right choice, hearing all this. Sometimes I wish I hadn't. It changes how you look at everything, doesn't it? The quiet sacrifices, the small lies we tell ourselves to keep going, the professional distance we build up as a shield. Do you ever wonder how many meticulous records exist out there, painstakingly detailing a disappearance, rather than a preservation? How many people carry the weight of knowing something that contradicts the official narrative, just because the truth is too inconvenient, too expensive, or just too heartbreaking for anyone to truly acknowledge? The old research station is just an empty shell now, baking under the arid sun. The sapphire glow of the screens is gone. Only the hum of the climate control lingers, a ghost of an effort, protecting an empty air. I wonder sometimes if Alara Vance ever looks at that smooth river stone she kept, the one Aris saw on her desk, and remembers the sharp, clear trill of a sapphire crested nocturne, calling for her when she used to leave. And if she hears it still, in the silence. Vance meticulously documented every failure, every lost bird, calling it remembrance. Do you see her life's work as a profound, heartbreaking act of memory, or merely an exhaustive obituary for a lie? If stories that reveal the quiet, crushing ironies of good intentions, and the difficult truths hidden beneath polished narratives, resonate with your own experience, you'll find a home here. Do you know someone who's had to carry the weight of a painful truth, or navigate the subtle compromises made in the name of a larger, perhaps flawed, mission? If you were Aris, after seeing Sapphire 7 die and knowing that failure to thrive was a sterile lie, would you have stayed in the field or walked away entirely? Tell me in the comments, I want to know. If the quiet cynicism of documenting a final exit instead of a true save resonated deep inside you, the like button is right there. If you're someone who recognizes the weight of meticulously documenting a disappearance rather than a preservation, and isn't afraid to confront those quiet truths, then this channel is for you.